I'm Julia.
I'm Rachel.
And I'm Kelly.
And this is What You Should Read,
a podcast where we should all over our books.
Today we have kind of a long episode. We are discussing the book Kindred by Octavia Butler a little bit later on. So we're going to get to that in just a few minutes. But first, Rachel, what are you reading?
So last night I finished a couple of books. I finished The Book of Longing by Sue Monk Kidd. It took me a lot longer than I thought because A, I was working a ton this week, and B, I didn't want it to end, so I wasn't picking it up, but eventually it had to end, and it was so good. One of the best books of the year so far. I also finished my graphic novel from the library, Queen of the Sea, and I really liked it, and I hope there's a sequel. But now I'm reading these Babysitter's Club graphic novels that I found at the store. It was like Maine's version of Costco. It's called BJ's, and it's like worse than Costco, but not as bad as Sam's Club. But I got Boy Crazy Stacy and the Babysitter's Little Sister, Karen's Witch. So
Aww.
Yeah, I'm working my way through those today, just kind of for fun, and then I'll probably pick up something else. And then on audiobook, I'm listening to 5 Days by Wes Moore, which we talked about on the podcast before. I can't make it show on screen. Sorry. So if you're on YouTube, sorry. But I got it from my library on audiobook, and I'm loving it.
Cool. Kelly, what are you reading?
I am reading The Air Affair by Heather Cox and Jessica Morgan. They are the women who do the website Go Fug Yourself. And it is the sequel to their book from several years ago, The Royal We, which is a totally fictional account of a royal couple who are not at all based on Kate and Will.
Totally fictional.
Totally fictional. And I have to read it for book club before tomorrow night. So by the time the episode drops, the people in my book club will know if I manage to succeed or not, because it's tomorrow night, Monday night.
You can do it.
Now in the past for the rest of you. Congratulations, life makes no sense.
Wow.
But I have about 420 pages to read today, so.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah.
I am still working on the second book in the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, so that's Obelisk Gate, and I've made some progress, not as much as I would have wanted, but not because it's not good. I'm really enjoying it. It's just I also had a very busy week at work, and I also was kind of just working my way through all of Jasmine Guillory's books on audiobook. So whenever I wasn't working, and I just felt like I needed to turn my brain off a little bit. Her books are just like ear candy for the audio versions. And so I've listened to all of them since I started her books earlier this month. So they did not take me long. I definitely think my favorite one was Royal Holiday. But The Wedding Date, the first one, is also my favorite. They're all my favorites, but those two especially. And I just finished Party of Two, which is her most recent one. So yeah.
Nice.
So now we have a new segment that we're introducing this episode, and it's called Recent Acquisitions. So the three of us have a problem. We cannot stop acquiring new books, whether it be books we've purchased, books we get from the library, books that we get from Scribd to listen to on our earphones. So we want to talk about these books because, in all honesty, I'm not going to get to all of them right after I buy them because I buy so many, or I get so many from the library, and it's a problem that we need to address. But I still want to talk about them, and I want to show everyone what I got. So I have a few recent acquisitions that I want to talk about. The first is Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo. And she is one of my favorite authors. She wrote The Poet X, and she wrote With the Fire on High. And this is a book about two girls who have the same father, but they don't know about each other, but they find out about each other when he dies. And so, yeah, and it's written in verse, and I'm usually not a big fan of books written in verse, but Elizabeth Acevedo is special, and I just loved the cover so much I had to have it. So let's clap when you land. And then speaking of N.K. Jemisin, I also bought The City We Became. Very cool cover. This is her book about New York, superheroes in New York. And we're going to read this for our book club that Kelly and I have later this month. And this is a book that I bought just on a whim. Like I said, I have a problem. This is called Everything is Figure-Outable by Marie Forleo. And it was recommended when I was on the website for Lit Bar, which is a Black-owned bookstore in New York. I was buying a couple books from her, and this was one of her recommendations. And I am a sucker for a good like self-help book. Cheryl Strayed had blurbed it. So it's sort of like, you know, ways to achieve your goals, how to keep track of time, how to, you know, solve these problems that everyone comes up against in life. So I don't know if it's gonna be good or not, but yeah, I fell for it. I bought it. So it looks
Cheryl
good.
Strayed would not lie to us.
I know. And Elizabeth Gilbert also blurbed it. So I think enough people have recommended it. I'm like, you know what? Maybe I need this.
Yeah.
Something called me to it. So
Sounds good.
yeah. Rach?
Well, one of my most recent acquisitions is I Know This Much Is True by Wally Lamb.
Oh,
Which
throwback.
it's an older. I mean, it's maybe 20 or so years old. I don't know. The 90s seems like 10 years ago, but
No, I don't remember if I read that one. I've read a couple of his books, but yeah, definitely when I was more like high school, college age.
Yeah. And I mean, I've heard really good things about it, but I don't even really know that much about what it's about. I know it's about two brothers, one of whom has schizophrenia and then does something, and it's the other brother's perspective for the most part of sort of what's happening and the fallout. Yeah, published in 1998. So, and it's very big. It's about 1,000 pages. Well, 900 pages. So it's another big book. And I haven't been reading the last couple of months my big books, but I'm still trying to I have so many big books. I've got Pillars of the Earth back there that I gotta get through, and I have The Secret History by Donna Tartt. So lots of big books to get through.
Yeah.
I saw the HBO series of I Know This Much Is True, and it was really, really good, but I haven't read the book.
It has Mark Ruffalo in it.
Yeah, he's amazing.
Really? Okay.
So that'll be my treat for finishing the big book, is watching that.
There you go. All right, Kelly, any recent acquisitions?
God, you know the answer is yes. So first I want to talk about I Am Here Now by Barbara Botner. It's another novel in verse. I did actually finish it, so it is a recent acquisition, but it's also something I finished. But I want to talk about it super, super fast because it's basically about the idea that one thing, like one talent, can save you. And it's about a teenage girl named Maisie, and she's in the 60s. And her mom is emotionally abusive throughout and occasionally physically abusive. Her dad is compassionate, but very rarely there. And so a lot of caretaking of her younger brother falls on her. And she is just kind of floundering. She doesn't really have friends. And then she learns that she's actually really good at art. And she ends up making a friend, and her friend's mom is also an artist. And she finds this community because of this one talent she has. And it makes the entire world of difference to her. And I love that. I love that art can save us, that, you know, just one person taking an interest can save us. And I thought it was absolutely wonderful. So I would recommend that. I think it's out on Tuesday, or maybe next Tuesday.
You already read your recent acquisition.
Well, yeah, but I needed to talk about it because it was so good. But my other recent acquisition that I have not read is Party of Two.
Oh!
The only one of hers I haven't read. And I have a vacation coming up, a long weekend in early August. And my plans are like me and that book and probably a few others. And I'm very excited.
It's that's a good vacation / long weekend pick. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So very excited. If it can stay unread for that long, because I'm really eyeing it. It looks really fun.
Okay, and now coming up next, we have our conversation with our friend Bekki Fahrer about our book for our big, you know what you should read segment, which is Kindred by Octavia Butler. And this is a really great conversation. So we will take a quick break. And when we come back, we will be talking about Kindred. And we are back. And we are joined by our friend Bekki Fahrer. Hi, Bekki. Thanks for joining us today.
Great to be here. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Yay! Yes, you are definitely a friend of the pod, for sure. And we are talking today about Kindred by Octavia Butler. And I guess before we dive in, Kelly, do you want to give a brief recap of this book? Although I will say, if you haven't read Kindred, you might want to read it before listening to this discussion, because it's, I mean, number one, it's an amazing book and everyone should read it, but I'm sure we'll get into a lot of topics and kind of dive pretty deeply. But just to start us off, Kelly, do you want to kind of give a rundown of what this book is about?
Yes, and before I do, super briefly, I have a tendency to say you, and I don't mean the three of you or the audience necessarily. It is a general you. And when I say we, I don't mean the four of us collectively. It is a general we. It is not aimed at anybody. So I have a tendency to do that and then people get mad. So blanket statement. And this is a very brief recap because you should read the book. Okay, so Dana is a Black woman who's married to a white man in the 70s. And throughout the course of the book, she is drawn back in time to the 1800s repeatedly. We don't know why at first. We learn why. And that's basically the briefest summary I can give. That's what you need to know going in, and probably all you should know going in.
Yeah, and she's pulled back into the Deep South. So yeah, and I think before we dive in, I also just want to highlight that obviously we are four white women discussing this book, and this book is about slavery. And there are a lot of perspectives and things that we just, because of our own experiences, can't really speak to. So I highly, highly recommend that everyone seek out commentary on this book by Black writers and Black reviewers and Black commentators. And we're going to link to a few in the show notes so that you can do that. And there's one NPR commentary by Lester Spence, who's a political science professor at Johns Hopkins. And he wrote an essay about what reading Octavia Butler meant to him as a young Black boy growing up in the 70s and 80s, and how it was his first introduction to science fiction that was written by a non-white writer, and just how much that meant to him. And so check that out. And we're also going to link to an essay by Octavia Butler herself on racism. So highly encourage that. And with that said, Bekki, I kind of
one more thing. We've also, and this time it is the four of us, we've also talked about the need for us specifically to read more authors of color, more diverse books, more own voices. And that means that sometimes we're going to have to talk about them, even though we are four white women, because there's no point in reading them if you don't talk about them.
Yeah, definitely. So Bekki, you actually recommended this book to us to talk about, and do you want to talk a little bit about why you chose this book to come on the podcast and talk about?
Sure. So I, as a woman in my 40s, decided to move halfway across the country and go back to grad school. And when I was doing that, I read a BuzzFeed article. I don't think it was BuzzFeed, it was something like that, that was like 50 influential sci-fi and fantasy books that you should all read. And I was like devastated that I had only read 15 of those. And so I decided that even though I was starting grad school in a completely new city and all this kind of stuff, that what I needed to do was set myself the challenge of reading the other 35. And very early on, I came across one of the books on the list was Kindred. And so I read it, and that from that first line, that first framing about the last time I had to go back, it cost me my arm. I was like, I don't know where this is going, but I am here for this. And I was completely unprepared for the depth of conversation that ends up being in here. And so often in fantasy or sci-fi, there's like a very clear, these are the good guys and these are the bad guys, and you know it, right? And what happens in this book is way more nuanced, and it has messy conversations, and it takes you on journeys that you weren't prepared for, and things that I don't often see talked about in fiction around slavery. And so I just, I latched onto this book, and it's among the 3 books that I proselytized the most in my lifetime. The other being The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell and American Gods by Neil Gaiman. But like, I just feel like everybody should read and wrestle with and get immersed in this the way Dana does. That time travel tool is just unique in putting us in a place that we wouldn't normally be and throwing us in there with the same jarring sensibilities, and then understanding how that like impacts the we us today. Anyway, I just think it's amazing. So when you ask me why I tell you everybody should read this book, this is why. I feel like we need to dive into that.
Yeah, I agree. And similarly to how you were devastated that you hadn't read this book yet, my initial reaction to this book is just, I am so angry that this was not required reading for me in high school.
Mm-hmm.
That week that I spent reading Jack Kerouac was a complete waste of time for everyone. And I could have learned so much more. And I just think it would be so important. And I know some schools do require it, which is fantastic. And I think every school should, because the way that we are taught history in our school systems, I think, is very whitewashed. And it's almost like we learn about slavery like it happened so long ago, right? Like it was then, and this is now, and it's over, and it's done, and everything's fine. And what this book really made me think about was, it really wasn't that long ago. When you think about it, it's nothing in the grand scheme of things. And also there's just so many lasting effects, that what this book did was made it just so stark how close we still are to that terrible time period, and how much we still have to grapple with it. And the time travel tool of just yanking Dana back to there just kind of highlighted that for me. So yeah, I thought it is an amazing book. And that was my gut reaction, was just, why wasn't I assigned to this in school? Why didn't I read this sooner? And I'm so glad I read it now, obviously.
Yeah, I pretty much decided by the time I finished reading that book that I'm just going to work on the entire Octavia Butler catalog, and highly recommend Parable of the Talents and Parable of the Sower. Those are also very excellent and very prescient to our time today. She was, her work is very timely, even though it was written, 20, 30 years ago.
Yes, for sure. Kelly and Rachel, what were your initial reactions to the book?
Well, for me, it was yours too. And I actually, as you were saying, why wasn't I taught this in high school? My high school probably wouldn't have, but I was an English major, and I took a course like women in literature, like basically women authors. And I'm like, this should have been one of those. And my professor did a really good job. Like, it wasn't all white women. I know we read Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, and we read The House on Mango Street. So it might be that, she didn't like the idea of us reading genre fiction. And I don't know much about sci-fi, but I thought this was just such an amazing achievement of a book. It's like, yeah, I really wish I had read it before now. But also, Bekki, you recommended or suggested a few Octavia Butler ones, And I know we were talking about which one, and I am so grateful we chose this one, because what if we hadn't and I still hadn't read it by this point in my life?
Yeah. I wonder, I know it's science fiction, right? It's categorized under science fiction. It has the time travel aspect, but I would not think of this as genre fiction, in my opinion. I wouldn't think of it that way, but yeah, maybe that is why, but I still don't think that that should factor in.
Right. No, I fully agree.
Yeah. Rach, what about you?
So I did not read any synopses or anything about this book before I started it, and I'm really glad I didn't, because I just felt like it took me on that journey of what's happening, what's going on. You know, I was in Dana's head of like, wait, what year is it? Where am I? What's happening? And I did love that. I love the experience of reading it. It is so good. I agree with everything you guys have said about it should be required reading. I also agree, it doesn't seem like genre fiction to me. It's more magical realism than it is science fiction, maybe. But yeah, the whole experience of Dana and Kevin and Alice and Rufus, I was so invested in what was going to happen, and it was just such a great experience reading this book.
Yeah, definitely. We all loved it. It's a great book.
5 out of 5 stars.
Yeah. So I thought we'd start the discussion off, and Becky and I and Kelly were texting before this about different things we wanted to talk about. And Becky, you brought up the scene where there's one trip back that Dana takes that Kevin, her husband, goes with her. And they're there for quite a while. And at one point, he is tutoring Rufus, who is this boy who keeps kind of calling Dana back in time. And Rufus is the son of the slave owner. So Kevin is tutoring Rufus, and then Dana starts tutoring Nigel, a young black boy. And they're talking about it, and Kevin says something to the effect of, you want him to be able to write his own pass when he gets older, and says something to the effect of, I see what they were saying about educated slaves. And it's this comment, and that prompts Dana to say, wow, the ease with which people can come to accept slavery is so frightening.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I thought it was Kevin that said that, the ease of which we, but maybe not. But I think that was one of the first takeaways that I had in this book, is this idea that as Dana and Kevin are experiencing life in this antebellum slave mansion and experiencing the realities of slavery, how quickly it becomes normal and natural, even though they're fighting it. Like, everything in their being is like, this is wrong, this is unjust, how can you, like, everybody's a human, how can you own another human? But still, in that moment, they realize how easy it is to just get into that and live in that space and embrace that idea, how easy it is for us who even are carrying normal human beings to move that needle towards oppression is almost terrifying. And I loved that the book wrestled with that, because I think we don't wrestle with it enough, because we spend our lives like living in this binary space thinking like, that is bad and I'm a good person, so I'm never going to do those things. But we don't realize how close it comes, and how quickly we can cross that line between us and the other not deserving the same things that we have, even if we're both human. So I loved that this book wrestled with that.
I totally agree. And it made me think a lot about how there are still oppressive and unjust systems today, very much so, that it does feel like, for the most part, it's just so easy to sort of accept and go along with. And when you stop and think about them, it's horrifying. But then, you know, like mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex, and it does this sort of highlighted that for me, just how close that is to that as well.
And even the idea that like Kevin and Dana never go back with the idea of we are going to change the system. They always have this idea of how we can adapt best to the system we find ourselves in. And I think when we're thinking in survival mindset, that's how we always are. We think about it in our world today. We think about it in many other places in history. Like, that ends up becoming the war of social justice is not evil. The war of social justice is almost either apathy or acceptance.
Right.
And that just kind of like really comes home in this space.
Right, that's interesting because Dana is sort of getting called back by Rufus, who we learn throughout the book is actually her ancestor. And she feels like, this is kind of jumping ahead from the outline that I had, but she feels like that's the reason she's there, right? Is to make sure that he survives so that her lineage, her family survives. She thinks that if she doesn't, something might change or her existence will be scratched out. But right, neither she nor Kevin really go in thinking they're going to change the system. I mean, they do some things, they subvert some things and try to teach people to read. And Kevin talks about, certain things that he did that got him in a little bit of trouble later on. But yeah, for her, the primary focus is just making sure he stays alive long enough for her her lineage to continue.
The thing that really struck me was really, it did not take Kevin long at all to start treating her a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm.
And I read a lot of commentary trying to educate myself and become a better ally. And one of the things that struck me is I see people, specifically Black people, saying that the problem with white people is that when it comes down to it, we will betray them every chance we get because it's easier to do that than it is to keep fighting and keep standing with them. And I was thinking, no, that's not always true. I mean, mostly true a lot of the times, 99% true, but it can't be true of all of us. And reading this book, I feel like it is true.
Yeah.
Because, it did not take him long at all to just start siding with the oppressor. And even back in the 70s, like, he still kept looking at her like she was other, like she was less.
I felt like though the Kevin character was confusing to me because there were some things that he did before they went on this time travel journey that to me were very, I don't know if it was misogynistic, if I would say, but there was one scene where he's like, why won't you type my novel for me? Like, what? He just expected her to do that. And I wasn't sure if that was indicative of the time period this was written. It was written in the 70s. And so it was referencing women's liberation and Dana saying, no, I'm not going to do that for you. And I'm like, I can't even imagine a character in a book set now even saying that. So for me, I was just kind of like, maybe it's not so surprising that he throughout the book still felt slavery is wrong, like this is wrong. But yeah, he was treating her differently. But I wonder if that should have been surprising to us given some of the things that happened in other parts of the book.
That is
I think the thing that I lay most at Kevin's feet is like that whole thing around the typing. Like what I realized is when she wouldn't back down, he was still like, that's not a deal breaker for me. I want to be in relationship with this woman. So I was like, okay, I can deal with that. The moment that got me is we've been seeing from from Dana's perspective, all this trauma that she's going through physically and emotionally. We see all the trauma that she's going through with Alice, which we'll introduce later, going through with Rufus. But when Kevin comes back to 1976 and he's lived in antebellum US for a while, and you hear that he's like helped harbor runaway slaves and got a little hurt, but he's pretty much survived, and he comes back and he's like, no, you need to stay away from me. I need to have my space. I need to like all this stuff for a while. Like, that's what I held at his door. I'm like, yes, you're traumatized, but your wife has been beaten and whipped twice. like, you don't get to be more traumatized than her in that moment. How dare you? Like, that was the very, very, like, most frustrating part for me for him, because I thought, and I think that that's so indicative, like, that is like blatant, like, something happens to me and I'm like, oh, trauma. And my friends who are people of color are like, yeah, that's every day. And I realized, like, the stark dichotomy there in that moment, and that's, I think, what I hold the most against Kevin.
And Dana automatically went into, take care of Kevin mode at that point. She was like, okay, I'm gonna let him do his thing, and I'm gonna, take care of the house and, get us some food. And, she totally, at that point, it was like she just shut down that part of her that was traumatized in order to take care of him, which I thought was very telling.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I think that happens so often. Black women are always the ones doing the work and being the most victimized, but taking care of everyone at the same time. And yeah, you're right. It happened here too. And I remember she was even worried that he wouldn't be writing, right? She was worried about his career. I totally agree. That was very, very indicative of the dynamic.
And kudos to Octavia Butler for calling that out even back in the 70s. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. She's such a great writer. So Kelly, I remember when we were texting earlier, we were talking about the character of Dana, and you were talking about this just sort of existential dread you had for her throughout the entire book.
Well, there was never a part in the book where I felt like she was safe, because even when she was back in her own time, knowing that she could be called back at any moment, and the fact that she literally had to have a bag with supplies that she would need within reach, and sometimes literally tied to her at all times so that she would have things she needed, I was always worried for her. And I wasn't worried about Kevin in the same way, because I knew that he would be okay no matter what. I guess for Kevin, my worry was, I worry that he's going to be a bad person.
Yeah.
But when Alice came back after running away with her husband Isaac when they were caught, then I spent the rest of the book worried for her and for Dana, but I noticed that I wasn't worried about the other enslaved people in the same way. And I think part of that is because we don't really get to know them the way that we get to know Dana and Alice. But also it made me really question my empathy, because, like, a lot of people, I always think, oh, I'm a really empathetic person. And it's like, really? You're not worried for these people the way that you are Dana? Like, what is that about? And maybe part of it is you can't be worried for a ton of people all at once. But I don't know.
Well, it's also a reflection of, I think, how Dana reacts to people around her as well. It's almost, and she even says how scary it is, like we were talking about earlier, how the ease with which one can accept slavery. And it's not that she accepted it, but right, maybe she had to shut down that part of herself that would just be enraged probably every waking moment at this system and what was happening to these people. But because she had her own immediate situation to consider, and then also Alice, who she got to know and knew was someone connected to her in some way, all of that worry went towards that. But you're right, when you step back and think about it, it's like, we all know that slavery is this monstrous, awful system, and how could we not just feel like this constant anger every moment, but yet we are pulled into the story.
Yeah. And that was another thing. I was immediately drawn into the plot, but I had to keep stopping, because I knew that if I kept reading for plot and to see if Dana would be okay and to see if, like, Alice would be okay, then I knew I would miss all the nuance. And so, like, every probably chapter break. I was like, okay, stop, sit with this for a little bit. But I feel like all I keep doing is just being like, this book is such an amazing achievement.
Mm-hmm.
Like, just an absolutely stunning achievement. And the fact that she does kind of lull the reader into a sense of complacency, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, we're just selling these children away from their family, we're selling this woman away from her husband, this woman who is free is now enslaved because we can do that. Yeah. And it is absolutely breathtaking, with what I would say is almost casual brutality. And I think she did that on purpose, because that's just the way it was. And why would you even be upset, Kevin? Because this is it's just.
Yeah.
But I think it's so shown up in the story of Tess, like the side story of Tess. Like the casual brutality, like you said, is just written rampant over her life. And yet the response to it is just sort of wearying, like even the person it's happening to. So Tess is a house slave, and the owner of the property, Mr. Whalen, rapes her on a regular basis, takes her to bed, as it's said in the book nicely. And she's barren, she doesn't have any kids, and then something happens and he's done with her. So he moves her out to be a field hand, and then his overseer, Mr. Fowler, I think was his name. I can't remember his last name, but he then gets to use her at his will, right? And she just resignedly goes with this. And at one point in time, she even says, "Here we are, and I'm like a dog. They say do this, and I do this. They say spread your legs, and I do all these things. And here I am. Now I'm out in the field. Now I'm in this place." And then they eventually sell her, and the whole thing is just like resigned. Like there's nothing. It's like there's nothing that can be done to stop that momentum. And everybody along the line is like, this just is how it is. It's just including the person it's happening to. And I think that affects so much how I even find myself steeped in this part of the story, like feeling dejected and resigned that this is just the system and there's nothing we can do, even though that is brutal to this one.
Well, she says, I think, something like, they don't think we have feelings. And I just saw on Facebook this morning, friend of the pod, Violet Gray, had a post about racist things that people were saying. And was it half of all medical students, I think, but like some shocking number, believe that Black people have thicker skin and don't feel pain in the same way. Like they literally don't think they have feelings. So, I mean, this belief just continues to affect people today. So we can't act like this is in the past. This is still happening.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's what's so good about this book, is how even though it is this time travel thing and written 40 years ago, it's just so present right now, speaking to things that we every day are seeing as injustice.
Absolutely. Well, I kind of want to talk about the character of Rufus, because Rufus is the reason that we think is the reason that Dana is getting pulled back to this time. And it's written in such a way that we are come to understand that whenever Ruf is in physical danger, he is somehow able to call Dana back to where he is so that she can save him. And she ends up saving him over and over. First time we meet him, he's 3 or 4 and he's drowning, and she has to run into the water and pull him out. And it happens over and over again. There's a house fire that she has to put out. He falls out of a tree. I mean, this kid is very accident prone. And
a house fire that he set incidentally.
Right. Yeah. So maybe he's just a little brat. He's a little brat who keeps but I think the question was, she's being called back to save him, quote unquote, but was he savable? And should Dana have let him die, would it really have made a difference? Because in her mind, she's thinking, she realizes that he's her great 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 grandfather or something, and she thinks, well, if I don't save him, then I won't be anymore. My ancestors wouldn't have been born, so ergo I wouldn't be alive today. But I mean, do we agree with that?
I mean, I think whether we agree with it or not, it's the perspective that Dana comes to.
Yeah.
So the worldview that she's working through. I mean, I don't know. It's the cyclical nature of time travel, isn't it?
Right, because at one point they say, oh, there's nothing we do that can change the past.
Right.
But yet she's operating under this. It is kind of a question that comes up in science fiction and time travel a lot. It's true. Yeah.
I guess I wrestle with whether he was worth saving or not. Like,
right.
Whether or not, I mean, because it's an existential thing for her, right? Because if he dies, then she doesn't exist, at least in her mind. So that already presents a problem for her, and just a huge sort of like metaphysical conflict of interest. But then her reasoning is like, if I can change him, if I can make him understand, if I can make things better, if I can build on the fact that he is friends with this little girl, Alice, like if I can work on these things, maybe he can stop slavery in his plantation. Maybe he can make a difference. Maybe he can free these lives, whatever it is. Like maybe that's what I can do. I think she kind of has that sort of wide open, like in some ways idealism around this, that I can change this man. It kind of breaks my heart that she even like tries to do that, especially given like the whole sweltering, festering cesspool that he lives in, the abuse from his father, just the whole nature of where he is and all the system around him, which is stacked against this one lone voice that pops in and out of his life being able to make any difference. But I also just wonder, like, what would have happened if she had just let him die?
Yeah.
Like, what if on that is a big question. And
right, because the other people who are enslaved on that plantation are telling her, oh, that boy's meaner than his father, right? Like they're telling her too about it. But I understand why she gets pulled in, and she thinks, well, maybe I can influence him and change him. And we, along with her, are disappointed throughout the book, right? I felt this disappointment along with her.
Yeah. It's so hard though, because you think, oh, it actually would have, like, even if it hadn't changed the whole system, it would have changed the lives for the 50 slaves on his property, or whatever along those lines. Like maybe it would have made a difference. Maybe Alice would not have gone from being a freed woman to a slave woman. Yeah, like
right.
Some of these things, maybe they would have happened differently. And I think even early on, Ruth wrestles with his better angel. Like he wrestles with that. Like there are some things that he struggles with, that he doesn't like, that he doesn't want to see, doesn't want to become like his father. And you think, oh, there is a possibility, there is a hope. And just seeing how much that gets dashed is really impactful emotionally in this.
I feel like it goes from, do I want to be the person who will let someone die, to do I want to be the person who will let this person die? And I think that really changes everything. Because initially I was like, come on, you can't just let somebody die. But then as the book progressed, I'm like, yeah, that guy specifically, Rufus specifically, needs to die.
Yeah.
I was not upset. I might have actually cheered.
And the fact that it took so long, and that she endured so much. Well, and I think this brings it into that question of metaphor, because I think the second time she comes back and she had been really beaten by Ruth's father, she calls her cousin to get her some groceries, and the cousin comes over and she said, I never took you for a person who would let a man abuse her. And of course, everybody thinks it's Kevin, and it's not. And she says, yeah, I never thought I would either. And yet, like, the way the all the things that Dana takes on herself, all the blows, all the every time she gets whipped, like everything she does that she takes into her own physical and emotional body before she crosses that line to kill Rafe is just extraordinary. And that question of like, I never thought you'd be that person who allowed someone to abuse her. And in fact, this is such an abusive relationship because he calls her when he needs her and discards her, or he manipulates her, he keeps her around, he does all kinds of things to prevent her from leaving him, and yet treats her with such disdain, and she allows it rather than the next time just shutting it down, right? Or even taking things into her own hands. And the fact that she has to get so desperate to do a suicide attempt to go home, or like all these different things that she does, like I just think, oh, what a horrible abusive relationship, which I think is also the metaphor of this, like the abusive relationship between people of color and white people in our country's history, and even still existing today.
It's also, I think, interesting when you contrast it to the character Alice's response to the abuse. And I think we should talk a little bit about Alice, who is, when we meet Ruth as a child, he says she's his friend. And as they grow older, he ends up raping her and is her abuser. And she, at no point, I mean, there is at some point where she, I don't want to say accepts it, but for the most part, she's pretty antagonistic and constantly planning how she can get out of it. And she gets mad at Dana, and Dana even says, I just take her blows, right? In Dana's mind, she's thinking, do what you need to do to survive. And in Alice's mind, it's, this is not worth surviving for.
Yeah, going through the book, a lot of the times that Dana goes back, it seems like Alice's life is in danger as well as Ruth. So it's almost like, who was Dana coming back to save? If she was coming back to save anyone, was it Rufus or was it Alice? And if it was Alice, did she fail or did she succeed? And when we got to the part of Alice's suicide, I was like, well, she's free from Rufus, which is what she wanted. But had Dana succeeded, maybe she never would have been, a victim of Rufus's in the first place. And this is me continuing to sort of ramble because my mind kept doing these like spirals of, was Dana thinking of her survival when she was also, trying to help Alice survive? I mean, she nursed her back to health from wounds that probably would have killed almost anyone else in that time period. She, encouraged her to, I wouldn't say encouraged, but she kind of helped Alice come to the realization that she needed to acquiesce and, succumb to Rufus, because otherwise she would be killed, sold somewhere where she would probably die. And
be separated from her children.
Exactly. And I just, in my head, I just feel like Dana, or maybe not Dana, but the story just failed Alice over and over again.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
That's such a fascinating perspective. And I think it's interesting that we, like Dana, came to this conclusion that she was always there to save Ruth. and didn't even think about like what does she owe to Alice. And I mean, I think again this speaks to the layers of Octavia Butler's imagination and her skill, but the idea that we are all going to that conclusion, but there could be another way of looking at this.
Right. Alice was also her ancestor, right? She was just as important to save if we're going by that that logic. Yeah.
And Alice had that whole incredible conversation. I think I'm skipping ahead in the outline. I apologize, but
that's okay.
That whole incredible conversation with Dana about whose body is this? Like, is it mine? Because Dana says, modern day sensibilities, it's your body. If you don't want to go to him, like, you can deal with the other, whatever. You have these other choices, which are horrible, but they're choices. And she goes, really? Whose body is this? Because it used to be mine, but now it's owned. And even thinking through, like, did Dana ever see Alice as actually being a self-possessed person worthy of something in the body that she had? And had to have that conversation where she even said that in light of the idea that maybe she was there to save Alice and never did. Like, that's a pretty poignant, powerful moment.
Yeah. Wow.
I know.
This book. Oh.
Yeah.
I don't even know where we are on my outline. Because like I feel like we've jumped around a lot.
That's okay.
I feel like though, obviously Alice made the choice to hang herself, but I really feel like Rufus actually murdered her because to punish her, he told her he sold her children. Yeah. And that's the point, as you said, like you, Bekki, and I were texting, and that was the point where I was like, I actively hate this guy. I never liked him, but I didn't actually hate him until he thought it was totally appropriate to tell the woman he says he loves that he sold their children.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, I would have brought them back. I just hadn't yet. And he didn't take any sort of responsibility for it. It didn't seem like it even really bothered him that his actions directly led to her death. And I mean, yeah, he was a product of his time, and everything he did, he was legally allowed to do, but just, I mean, he said he loved her though.
Yeah, and I also don't think that being a product of one's time, what I'm learning more as I read more is it's not really an excuse, because there was anti-racist thought and writings in every time period. If you go back, I'm reading Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi, and he talks about that, how like during that time, people were writing anti-racist pamphlets and abolitionists, and even before that, you know, every time there were racist policies or racist movements, and there were also anti-racist responses. So those thoughts and feelings were out there. And so we can't really say because he was in that time period, he's excused from any behavior, because they knew, you know, it was
and
there.
Also, how many conversations did he have with Dana? And he was not stupid. He was way more astute than anybody ever gave him credit for, and processed so many things, but he knew enough to not do certain things. Was way more manipulative, like everything with the letters not being sent to and his whole conversation with them about like, you are two sides of the same coin, and how Alice said like what he wants is you during the day and he wants me in nighttime, and that idea like of how long it was going to be. And everybody warned Dana, and she just didn't pay any attention. But
she was like, "No,
no." Gonna be before he crossed that line with her.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I totally agree.
This totally just struck me. Like he said, they were like the same woman. Like they were each half of the same woman. So he didn't view either of them as actual people. They were almost a whole person when you put them together.
Yeah.
And
they are to serve him too. Not only that, but they were both
Yeah.
the same person, both of whom were there to serve his different needs at different times.
yeah. God, I didn't think I could hate him more, and now I'm just like, I hope it
Yeah.
hurt. When she stabbed him, I hope it hurt. I hope
Yeah.
he lingered for days.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I also I was so pleased with when they went back to find out what happened, realizing what Nigel did. And I just was so like,
Yeah.
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 That's another moment when
like
they
that.
were able
Burn it all to the ground.
yeah. When they were able to go back and find the exact spot, that moment I was just like, whoa. And it again highlighted how not that long ago this all happened. You know, it felt like the timelines were merging even through the book. Like, you know, soon we're going to get to the year when Harriet Tubman, you know,
Mm-hmm. Really
starts
close
doing
to
her thing.
this man, Frederick Douglass, and he said that, you know.
Yeah, that was so interesting when they started talking about historical timelines and what was going to happen next. And they knew what was coming, but the people around them didn't know what was coming. That was very, very interesting. Okay. We haven't talked yet about, you know, Kevin. Well, we talked a little bit about Kevin, but, you know, his white privilege, how did that help him and them together when he goes back with her, and how did it not?
Well, I actually think, I think the moment that I saw Kevin's white privilege the most was not even before they get back in time, but it was when he saw her going and he just wrapped himself around her. Like, he either thought, I can keep her here, or he thought, I can go with her and I can save her there. Like, it was just this, like, and I know it probably came out of love for his wife in this moment, but just that idea that I'm going to be okay. I can make a difference. I can fix this. Even that as an instinctual response just made me go, you know, to kind of see in place. And like the way she consistently had to coach him about, you can't do that. You can't be seen. Like, we're not these, you have to listen to me because it'll go worse for me if you don't.
Right.
It was just so evident in like, especially in the early days when they were there together. And his whole thing, like, I want you in my room with me, and what that cost her in the long run was devastating. But for what? Like, for what?
Yeah.
And the fact that they just like assumed that he was things and took him at face value for that, but would never do the same for her, was
right. And his presence certainly offered her a measure of protection, right, while she was there. But you're right, it garnered so much suspicion amongst others that when she went back without him, it probably made things worse for her in the long run.
Yeah.
When he went to grab her, didn't she like say no, don't or something? She did, right?
The second time, yeah, she was like, no, Kevin, no. And he didn't that time. He let her go.
Yeah, because I feel like the whole book, he always was so sure he knew so much more than she did.
Right.
Even in this, I mean, this time where I'm not an expert, certainly, but more familiar with it than he is, because she's been there before, and he does not listen.
Yeah. Things like, I'm going to make you papers to show that you're free. I'm like, they can just tear those up, Kevin. That's not going to work, right?
Yeah.
Also, I thought tangentially to this, because he did so much research and reading after her first like time back, and he was trying to figure out exactly what, you know, what might be needed and what might be the most beneficial. But the time that she was back without him and she did this, she just was like so appalled by the pretty pictures of slavery in all these books that she was reading around them. And I was like, oh, I just loved that sort of different perspective from the two of them. Like, he was all like, oh, I found this and we'll know this and we can have all this stuff. It's going to be our arsenal for help. And she was like, actually, really not this. It's Gone with the Wind, really not this.
Yeah. This is useless information. It's fiction. Yeah, it's sort of portrayed as this idyllic, like pastoral, like, oh, it was just like a really like quiet time, you know. It does. I mean, yeah, we all learned such a whitewashed version of history. It's really, really upsetting.
Yeah.
Anything else should we talk about, you know, moving forward? It would be great if this book were made into an adaptation, I think, and brought more. And I saw a preview for a movie or a show that at first I thought it was Kindred, but it's not, right?
Yeah, I the first time I saw the trailer for Antebellum, I was like,
yeah.
Oh my gosh, they made Kindred, and they put, oh my gosh, I was so excited. And then it wasn't. And then I was like, swear word, because Octavia Butler deserves this.
Yeah, for sure.
Yep.
Yeah. Janelle Monáe included.
Oh, that would be amazing. Yeah, I get a little sad when I think about the books that Octavia Butler never got to write, because she died when she was still in her 50s, right?
Mm-hmm. I think so.
Very young.
Definitely young.
And she wrote so much, but I feel like we probably would have gotten even more amazing novels from her.
Yeah.
Some of the fascinating things that she does have a lot to do with body and sense of body, which, you know, if you read like Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, or you read like Roxane Gay's Hunger, like there's a lot of conversation around, you know, Brittany, I can't remember her last name, Eloquent Rage.
Oh, Packet?
I have it on my shelf. Brittany Cooper, Eloquent Rage. Like there are all these conversations around the experience of living in the Black body and what, how society sees it, how it's seen by white, you know, like just all those experiences. And the thing of Octavia Butler is she's having these same conversations, but putting in these wide ranges of like sci-fi and fantasy experiences. And it still keeps coming back to wrestling with this same sense of being in self and worth and perspective and the way it's seen. And I just love that. I love it when a sci-fi author can take something that we're struggling with in the real world and put it in a completely different setting and then blow it up for the ridiculousness that it is and why our perspectives need to really be changed, or explore and plumb the depths of why this is such a problem. And she does that just across so many of her books.
Indeed. Everyone should read her books, especially this one, but I'm going to definitely be reading all of her books now. I read Parable of the Sower and this one, and yeah.
And I think Parable of the Sower, go ahead, Kelly.
Oh no, I said same. That was all I had. I'm sorry.
I also think that Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents are so, like have so many ties with today and what we're experiencing today.
Sure. Apocalypse.
Political upheaval, situations, global poverty, and climate change. So all of those get tied into the whole Earthseed thing, and the fundamentally fascinating premise that God is change is really an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah. Well, any final thoughts or anything that we didn't touch on that anyone wanted to discuss?
I just super fast wanted to say the conversation that Alice and Dana had about why she named Dana's ancestor what she did. And her sister's name is, I think, Hagar is how you would say it. And Alice said, in the Bible, people might be slaves for a while, but they didn't have to stay slaves. And I just, like, in a whole book that just struck me over and over and over, that one just actually literally took my breath away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Very much so. And I, you know, like there's so much we can talk about in here. I loved the conversation about Sarah being the mammy type and kind of having that conversation of like the slave that is overseeing other slaves and and sort of meting out punishment, but also still a slave, kind of like that mindset. And then also finding herself in Sarah's footsteps, or like in Sarah's role, doing the same thing and wrestling with that. Like, I think that's also a good conversation. I don't think I could do it justice, but I think it's worth pointing out that she also does have these incredibly nuanced conversations about stereotypes, or not even stereotypes, but types, and conversations around the different roles that different people played within slavery, even Black people or enslaved people at that time. And I think it's, again, brilliant, and things that sometimes I wouldn't have even thought of. And then here she's presenting it in such a way that it gets under my skin and I can't not wrestle with.
I agree. I think this book is one I will need to reread several times to really get all of those nuances under my skin. And yeah.
Right.
Also, a plug for the graphic novel version of this. It is actually well done. And they do some visual things that are really cool, like talking about how when Dana keeps getting pulled back, like how they make her hair grow, and explaining how that kind of shows span of time.
Wow.
and just really interesting pieces like that. The way they crafted the different people visually, as well as what they chose to keep in and highlight in the graphic novel, is really good. It's really well done.
I also want to shout out the audio version. I listened to a lot of this on audiobook, and I thought it was great. Just the narrator, I can't remember the narrator's name off the top of my head. Let's see if I can find it.
I also definitely think that it should be made into something. I don't want it as a movie. I would really love it to be an HBO miniseries.
Yes.
They can like actually be like, allow some of the brutality to be visible, and also spend the amount of time with it that they need to. And I definitely think certain actors to play certain roles.
Absolutely. Yeah. The narrator of the audiobook is Kim Staunton, and I thought she did a great job, especially with every character had a distinct voice for every character. It was so good. Yeah. Okay. Wow. This was a great discussion, and thank you so much, Bekki, for joining us and for recommending this book to us. I'm so grateful that you did.
So shout out, I'm going to plug, there's a DC bookstore that you should go to buy this book, to read it. There's a Black-owned bookstore called Mahogany Books here in DC, and it specializes in only books by authors of color and books that highlight protagonists and people of color. So you should definitely go to Mahogany Books. It's a locally owned bookstore here in DC. You can get it online as well. Buy Kindred from them, and the graphic novel, and a plethora of other amazing books by Octavia Butler.
Yay.
Great. We will link to them in our show notes too, so you can check them out.
All right. Bonus content. We're going to have a special round of what you should read. Bekki is going to recommend a book to all of us. So Bekki, take it away.
So actually, I'm going to recommend a series to each of you.
Ooh.
Wow.
It'll be fun. So for Kelly, I know that you are not generally in the sci-fi genre, but I feel like there's a sci-fi series that exactly fits who you are. Imagine a main character who would really just like to sit in his own space, read his books, listen to his music, and watch his favorite videos. But sadly, because things happen and humans are stupid, he has to venture out of his little bubble and fix things.
A tragedy.
Martha Wells' series, The Murderbot Diaries. And they are phenomenal. It's 4 novellas and a full novel. The audiobooks are fantastic. There's a mystery element to each of them, and I freaking love them, and I think you would find them just fantastic.
What's the murder what?
The Murderbot Diaries.
Okay.
Murderbot is the main character. He is a human cyborg hybrid that hacked his own governor module and is now making choices rather than just going out and doing what the company.
You have cut the core of me, Bekki.
I know. Like, I was like, oh, and then I met the author and I was like, oh my gosh, you are amazing. I love these books. They're so good. And she's like, you signed my book. I'm like, oh, you wrote that. Like, they're autobiographical. It was amazing. Anyway, so that's what it is. And Rachel, my recommendation for you is a series of books that is now quite long, but it has both the element of mystery and feminism and philosophy all rolled into a delightful series. It is by, oh my gosh, the first one is The Beekeeper's Apprentice. It's the Holmes Russell murder mystery series. So it's Sherlock Holmes in later life meets a younger woman, and she becomes his apprentice and walks alongside, and they are fantastic. The author of
Laurie R.
King. Laurie R. King, yes. And I was like looking down because they're right behind me, like right down here. But they are fantastic. They are great mysteries. They're so much fun. And she is like, the author is like a fantastic activist and makes some very powerful statements, especially in our lives today. So I highly recommend them. And they are just awesome. Also, great female protagonist. Because she, even though she's in relationship with Sherlock Holmes, he is like not the main focus of everything. So yay.
It sounds
Julia,
perfect for me.
So Julia, my series recommendation for you is a series by Elliot Kay, and it is a sci-fi series, but again, very prescient to today's society. And the first one is called Poor Man's Fight. The premise is Earth, we colonized other planets, and there are different colony systems, but the thing that ties them together are three major corporations that provide assistance in education, provide military assistance, provide economic assistance, but basically the system is set up to keep everybody in debt to these corporations. And it's a planetary system that decides to stand up against that, and one kid who is kind of caught in the mix of it and has to make some different life choices. There's a lot of injustice, and then there's great swashbuckling space action. And
I love a space book.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the series is fantastic, and the audio are really great. I have torn my way through 3 of them already, and like I put them on, and I don't want anybody else to bother me. I just want to listen to my book. So.
Oh, that's so exciting. That sounds perfect. I love a book about space and social institutions. I'm here for it.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
So this is great brain candy, and also with, great subtext and not so subtext.
Yeah.
So those are my recommendations for you all.
That was such a treat. Thank you, Bekki.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can't wait.
Yay.
And that's our show. Be sure to follow us on social media. We are WYSR_podcast on Instagram and Twitter. We are on Goodreads at What You Should Read Podcast. You can also email us at whatyoushouldreadpodcast@gmail.com. And thank you again to Bekki for such a great conversation and for such great recommendations.
And now you know what you should read.
You're welcome.